pay back his creditors. So he went back to the architect and said, I need to make it a little bit higher. And the architect said, well, there's really no buildings that high. And he said, and who's going to be willing to pay, a huge exorbitant rates for, to walk up 12 flights of stairs to the hotel room? And so he was like, yeah, you're right. And he was kind of depressed. He was walking away and was looking at the trains that were running. And he came up with the idea of the vertical railroad, which basically was an elevator. And so Potter Palmer, while he's not a mechanic or an engineer, he came up with the idea of the elevator. And it was actually Otis, who's credited with developing the elevator, that came to the Palmer House and saw this vertical railway that would take people up to their rooms. And he said, do you mind if I, borrow this or and he said, what do I care? I'm in the hotel business. And so Otis kind of took the idea and ran with it. So Potter Palmer actually invented really the elevator out of that whole thing.
So. And if I'm not mistaken, he was the first residence to have an elevator in his house, the Potter Palmer Castle on Lakeshore Drive. He had an elevator in the house.
Right. Well, that would make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Well, since we talked about some of the people affected, I guess we'll go to Mrs. O'Leary, since we kind of touched on possible causes of this whole thing. I guess now would be the time to talk about, the theories as to what may have caused the Great Chicago Fire.
I'll start off real quick on that. Mrs. O'Leary was a scapegoat from the very beginning. There's a Chicago Journal paper. Somehow, October 9th, the next day, while Chicago was burning, they found the ability to print out edition of the paper, and they immediately blamed her while Chicago was burning. And she got the bad rap for it. Now, it's true, it did start there. It's 137 DeKoven, where the Chicago Fire Academy is now. And but she, like I said, her testimony, they had a big inquiry afterward, and they interviewed everybody. And she had extensive questioning. And she was adamant. I had nothing to do with this, and she wanted nothing to do with the memorials and the anniversaries. And she even she said, I went to bed early that night. And she furthermore said they kept coming to her house years later. Get out of here! And then they asked her for a picture, and she says, you'll never find a picture of me on the face of the earth. And to this day, we have no idea what Mrs. O'Leary looked like because her picture cannot be found anywhere. She had the last laugh. But as far as how it started, we don't know. There was the O'Learys owned this double like a house. They lived in a shanty in the back, and they rented the front part out to the McLaughlin family, another Irish family. And that night, the McLaughlin family had a family member that had just come to America from Ireland, and they were celebrating, and Mr. McLaughlin was somewhat of a fiddle player, and they had a little party. Of course, you think immediately they're all drunk, they're Irish. Well, according to them, they weren't drinking, they had no alcohol. And, sorry, Ray. And
well, that's okay. So, I got a couple good Irish jokes.
I resemble that remark.
He was playing the fiddle, and Mrs. O'Leary's heard the fiddle, and Pegleg Sullivan is a neighbor who actually had a peg leg, and he heard the fiddle for a little bit, and then there could have been one of the people at the party that went back there to try to get some milk from one of the cows to make milk rum. But they testified, no, we didn't do that. There could have been kids playing that back there, whatever happened and started in that barn. Mrs. O'Leary had no reason to milk the cows at 9 o'clock at night. She did it in the morning. Pegleg O'Sullivan, some people that suspect him, he was sitting there on the fence, by the fence across the street, just taking in the nice night before he hit the sack, and he heard the fiddle playing, and according to him, he saw the barn catch on fire, and he hobbled over there. And he immediately woke up Mr. O'Leary, Patrick O'Leary, ran in the barn, and tried to save Mrs. O'Leary's cows. And his testimony was it was all, chaos and smoke, and he got his peg leg stuck in the floorboards. And he's like on the process of dying, and he yanks out his leg, and the peg stays on the floorboards, and he falls on one of the cows, and the cow, it sounds like a Indiana Jones movie, and the cow runs out with him. And most of the cows were killed, but he was spared. Now, some people suspect him because the place he supposedly saw the barn burn, there's real estate records, there was other houses in the way, you couldn't see the barn. He changed his story 3 to 4 times. He's very unreliable, and there's some people that suspect he's the guy that started it. But to this day, we have no idea how it started. That's just the bottom line.
Yeah, I was going to say there's the comet theory also. You guys expand on that a little bit? You talked about that briefly earlier as well. Ray, you want to jump on that one first?
Sure. I mean, the comet theory kind of makes a lot of sense because in the book we kind of put together this map of where all these kind of fires occurred that same night, and it does kind of give you the impression of it being more or less a debris field. It almost looks like when there's a plane crash or something like that, the shape of the debris field is kind of the same shape that you have between Chicago, Peshtigo, Holland, Michigan, Manistee, Michigan, and in the Port Huron area. So, yeah, I mean, it's true that there was a drought. It's true that fires were common. But really you have Peshtigo being completely annihilated, Holland being completely annihilated, Manistee being completely annihilated. It's not as though, it's not unusual for there to be a fire in all of these cities, but for it to be all on the same night, almost at the exact same time in the evening of the 8th, and the intensity of each one of the fires, even though some of these towns are smaller, Holland wasn't all that big, Manistee wasn't all that big, but yet the same descriptions are pretty much across the board as far as people claiming that the air was on fire. It was a very common way of describing it. So, I mean, John said, we don't really know what had happened. There was supposedly, John actually knows the story better than I do, but basically it was a comet that was named Beulah, if I remember correctly, and people were expecting to see it. And then at 1 year it split into 2 comets, and then they were expecting it around the time of so there was a Beulah 1 and a Beulah 2, and then right around the time of the October fire is when they expected to see these 2 halves again, and it never showed. So it's kind of coincidental that all this stuff was going on at the same time. The fires all burned. It's hot. I mean, Peshtigo obviously was huge. Chicago was huge. Manistee and Holland were huge, but comparing the fires, they weren't as big or didn't cover as much area, but yet the same type of description was the same no matter what area people were talking about. So anyway, if I had to choose something, if I was a betting guy, I'd bet on the comet or meteor shower type of thing. It would make sense.
Yeah, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd probably give it like an 8 or a 9. Biela comet, it's spelled B-I-E-L-A. It was first discovered in 1832, and they had astronomers back then. And, like Halley's Comet, it comes around at regular intervals, and it was again seen in 1839. But then in 1846, it was seen by multiple astronomers as 2 comets. They had some kind of collision in space, and it made big news. And so they named it Biela 1 and Biela 2. And then the next time in 1852, they were separated by millions of miles, so the trajectory was off, and it was visible for 3 weeks. So we don't know what was going on. And then the next expected returns, 1859, 1865, it didn't even show. So the theory is that one of them veered off out of the solar system and it's still out there somewhere, way the heck out in space. And the other one, just the opposite, it got pulled in by gravity, and the next expected sighting was for early 1872. But again, it got here sooner, if this is it, in October. And people say, well, how can it be a comet? There's no crater. They don't go into the impact of the Earth itself. It actually, in the atmosphere, is dissolved and it's full of methane and other gases. When it mixes with oxygen, it's extremely hot. and flammable, and also the comets travel in a triangle shape. And what hits first, it comes down like a big parachute, and if it dissolves, what hits first are the corners, the three corners. And the three corners of the triangle would be Chicago, Peshtigo, and the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. And so, I mean, all that put together is like evidence in a court of law, although it's not ironclad, it's not 100%, it's certainly a viable theory.
Yeah, I mean, it works better than a cow knocked over a lantern, in my opinion.
Well, there's some people that said, well, the Chicago fire started all the other ones. And it's like, yeah, well, you know, for the fire, I mean, the Chicago fire was pretty brutal, but I don't think it jumped Green Bay. And plus, it would have taken a while to get there, so there's no way they all would have started at the same time.
Yeah. You know, if this is actually true, like I said, first it jumped the Chicago River, the branch of the Chicago River, and then it jumped Green Bay. And in a panoramic view of the entire triangle, it really looks like it jumped across Lake Michigan, which is really tough to believe. But, yeah, I mean, because it's like
it's only 100 miles. It's only 100 miles across, you know. So. Yeah. So.
Oh, hogwash, Ray.
Hogwash.
Don't let facts get into the way of a good story.
Hogwash. Oh, you're right. It was a strong wind.
Yeah,
30
very
miles
strong.
Well, it was. But.
Okay, so the rain and everything else helps to fizzle it out. I know the rain wasn't a lot, so I'm sure it wasn't the rain by itself. It ran out of fuel, all those things. The fire fizzles out. And what happens from there? I understand Chicago actually, technically, in a way, kind of benefited from the whole thing, and I don't want to, like, make light of the situation, but, I mean, Chicago kind of scraped themselves up and got better, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people point to the Chicago fire as being the start of the actual city of Chicago. I mean, even though technically it was founded in 1853 and 1837, it really wasn't much of anything. And then it was the rebuilding that actually caused them to actually start building with a plan. Chicago kind of just grew as they needed it, and there were times where they actually changed streets and had to make people move their houses because it didn't line up correctly with the streets. And so after the Chicago fire, it was kind of like, well, we need a plan and architects and workers, and so a lot of what, I mean, Chicago actually kind of owes its rebirth to the Chicago fire, to be honest. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah, and Chicago became the fastest growing city in the history of the world between 1871 and 1893. In 1871, we had like 300,000 people living here, and many people thought, well, that's the end of Chicago. The fire just destroyed the whole city. And just the opposite, everybody flocked here, and real estate, and just grew. And by 1893, we've got 1 million people living in Chicago. Think about that. 300,000 in 1871 and 1 million after the fire in 1893. We had the big World's Fair that summer, of course, and the big day was Chicago Day at the World's Fair, October 9th, which celebrated the fact that, look at here, the anniversary of the fire. Look how far we've come.
Yeah, and you talk about being burned to the ground, and then you're hosting literally the world for 6 months. So for 6 months, the whole world was looking at Chicago, and really a lot of the things at the World's Fair, especially like the Japanese exhibit on Wooded Island, used the Phoenix as kind of the theme of the World's Fair, because you're talking like literally just a little over 20 years ago, there was nothing, and now we've got a huge city, and we're hosting one of the largest, if not the most attended World's Fairs ever. So it was really a feather in the cap for Chicago to prove to the world what they could really do.
Right. Yep.
How was Chicago able to bounce back so quickly? I mean, you guys think most places would have been bankrupted by it. I know insurance companies went out of business because of the whole thing.
Well, a lot of, I mean, I think what it was that you had a lot of speculation, real estate speculation